And I pass the turn.
All right, I'll untap, upkeep, no triggers, draw a card. Ooh, actually, you know what? I think I just gotta call a judge. I got a quick question.
Yeah, call a judge.
Judge? Judge! Hello. Hi there. Welcome. Have a seat. It's time for Lucky Paper Radio with me, your host Andy, and my co-host Anthony, tapping Hope Tender for 3 mana Maddox.
You'll love to see it.
You love to see it.
Don't you?
Yeah, you love to see it. This actually leads right into our first topic, because I want to talk a little bit about Hope Tender. We played your cube this past week in person, the first in-person draft of any cube in, 14, 15 months?
I don't know. Some time out of time, it's so good to actually be able to play with my friends, with paper, be able to flick paper magic cards. I missed it so much.
I really love paper magic. It's so important to me that we play with actual cards and not play digitally. I get so much less joy of playing digital magic. So it was great. I agree.
You say it was great, but...
Yeah, my team lost very badly. I have a couple of complaints to register. The first is that we did an 8-person team draft, which I think is nonsense.
Why is that nonsense?
Because we basically did an 8-person draft where the pairings were dog shit for round 2, and a bunch of people had to pair up. That's all we basically did.
I think doing the pairings based on match wins in what we did doesn't actually make sense. I feel like an 8-person team draft is completely reasonable. I don't know why you suddenly have an issue with something so clean and obvious.
Well, we had 8 people, so we should do a normal draft. That's the brilliance of it.
But why is a 6-person team draft better than just a 6-person draft?
It's only better because a 6-person draft, you already have no good pairings for round 2 anyway, because you can't possibly pair normally.
That's the problem you're trying to solve.
So
with
the problem
a 6-person draft?
The problem you solve is that instead of having random pairings round 1 and then just one person randomly gets a bad pairing round 2, you just throw pairings out the window and play everybody on the opposing team.
Okay, so I see this completely differently, which is why it's important to, evaluate your goals and why you're doing things.
And communicate.
And communicate, and not just take things for granted and say we're doing it the one normal way. For me, the issue or what team drafting offers is not that it fixes the pairings a little bit, which is to me kind of marginal, but that it actually, we always talk about make the fun thing, the optimal thing, the correct thing to make a game fun, right?
Of course.
Or at least Morrow talks a lot about it.
Find the fun, baby.
I like to talk about it too. And one of the most fun parts about Magic for me is talking about my deck building, talking about the game, talking about Magic, the gathering, right?
Yeah.
And when you're doing a team draft, you get to do that. You get to lean over and say, well, should I mulligan this hand? Or, I have this one removal spell. Here are the other removal spells left in my deck. Is this a threat I need to deal with right now? And just being able to talk with your teammates makes the game so much more fun. And you want to do this normally when you're playing in a normal draft, but making it actually optimal to do that is, to me, amazing. And that's why, at some point when we recently did a team draft, I was just thinking, this is all I want to do. Why do we do Cube any other way? And sure, it's great to have the opportunity to have that really rare, exciting triumph of a 3-0, but I would be happy to do 80% team drafts. So what we ended up doing, what we ended up doing is just an 8-person team draft where we just played 2 rounds, because honestly, if you're doing a normal draft, most people start flagging after round 2 anyway. So we just did random pairings, and we tried to pair up as you would in a normal 8-person draft, but I don't think that's even necessary. I think just 2 rounds of random pairings, first team to 5 wins. This is a great way to play Cube to me.
Okay, I hear you. I do love team drafting. I love it as a elegant solution to the problem of a 6-person draft. And frankly, here's what I wish. I wish that the actual drafting component was more modified with Cube than it is normally. I think team drafting a retail limited set is really fascinating because I think the hate drafting component is much more relevant.
Right.
We've talked in the show about how, given that you're never going to be stuck with playables or stuck with unplayables in most Cube environments, and also given how most Cube environments, at least the ones we play, have a much narrower band of power level than retail limited formats, it's oftentimes just not right to hate draft, it feels like, in Cube. And so it ends up being kind of a normal draft. Our teams talked a little bit, I guess, but, ultimately, I'm fine to play a regular Cube draft where you're allowed to ask a neighbor if you want a mulligan that's not playing in your game.
You're always... able to do that, but is your opponent
Well, I mean,
going to care?
you're not.
But is your opponent going to care?
You definitely
is your
can't.
opponent
You
gonna be
definitely can't
invested
in a GP lean over and say, "Hey, am I allowed to keep this
I mean,
hand?"
we're not,
I think you're going to get a judge
we're
call.
not in a GP. There's no cube GP.
Even F&M, I'm pretty sure even F&M rules enforcement level, you're not allowed to do that and
Sure.
might get a warning.
I see. So for you, that's marginal. For me, that is huge. I mean, that just makes the experience so much more fun of not just being allowed to talk to somebody else, but actually making that the optimal thing and making it like having other people invested in my game. And, oh, I finished my round. I'm not just like twiddling my thumbs here. I actually want to see the outcome of these matches because it affects me. That just makes it so much better.
I agree. I think that's great. As the team that, went 1-3 in round one, to have two of us get paired up against another winning deck did not feel great, but that's just how it is, I guess.
I mean, you're going to get paired up when the other team has all better decks.
But you're not if you do a regular 8-person draft, and everyone gets to play a person with the same record, is my point in round two.
Okay, that's fair.
I think you get more good matches of Magic that way than basically. And to be fair, if round one had been 2-2, right, then we would have had perfect pairings and it would have been great. It just so happened that our team drafted all aggro decks, and they did not go well that night for us. It was not the night for aggro to shine.
They sure didn't. I think we hate drafted just right.
Certainly, well, actually, I felt like one of my team members did the most successful hate drafting against your team member playing the black zombie synergy deck.
Oh yeah, there was some.
That was
cuts.
the best example of hate drafting I saw. What was the best hate drafting you saw on your side of the table from your team?
I mean, it is a little bit hard to say, and it's interesting that you point out, like, you want hate draft to be more relevant, which is another feature of team drafts. And we've been talking a lot about a cube that does offer a really wide power delta. So
yeah, I wonder if the rare
that particular
module cube
is another thing. Like, I'm really excited about it for sealed, and I'm really excited about it for team draft as well. As far as my hate drafting strategy, I just went really deep on lands. I took as many lands as I possibly could, which I think is a reasonable strategy.
I think it's a good normal strategy, honestly.
Well, especially in team draft where you're just opening yourself up to be able to take weird rares or weird power outliers later. And a lot of my opponents lost to being mana screwed, so that works out, right? And then late in the draft, I definitely just took some powerful cards that were not going to fit my deck. So things like Soul Herder, Young Pyromancer, Rune of the Hidden Realms, which no one ends up playing, but I think is a pretty powerful card.
Definitely, if you end up at a board stall, Rune will break that board stall wide open, I imagine. But this brings us to our first point, which is Hope Tender.
Hope Tender.
Can you give us the rules text of Hope Tender off the dome? I bet you can.
I can try. Is it a 2/2? That's the hardest part.
No, I don't think it is. I think
it's a 1/2.
Maybe it is a 2/2 actually.
So it's a 2-mana creature. It's
one
for
and a
1 and green. It has 1 generic tap, untap a land, and it has 1 generic tap and exert, which means it doesn't untap in the next untap phase. Untap 2 lands. So it's not really a mana dork, right?
No, not under normal circumstances.
Because it doesn't just tap for mana. What it does as a baseline is it just lets you filter your mana. So if you have 2 untapped lands, you need the double white source. You can tap your forest, untap your plains, and get 2 whites. If you exert it, it does ramp you by 1. For 1 turn, but then you don't get it next turn. But the trick with this is you have lands that are like the bounce lands that tap for 2 mana. And did I say if you exert, you untap 2 lands, right?
Did say that,
I did say, okay, great. Perfect. That's what
You're doing great. You're doing a perfect podcast, baby.
Perfect podcast. So if you have multiple bounce lands, and again, like I said, I drafted the lands very aggressively. I think I had 4 or 5 bounce lands in my deck, which is...
That's half of them.
Kind of sketchy in itself because you can end up with some clunky hands. But
you do a little bit of discarding to hand size on turn 2 when you just don't have a turn 1 or 2 play.
It's worth
your
it.
Only land.
You think, oh, I hate discarding, but also, hey, you have 5 lands that have draw a card stapled to them. It ends up working out okay.
Yeah, it does feel bad to discard in that situation. You're right, but to your point, you got 2 lands for 1 land, so just discard a land, and then it's as if you didn't have
Problem
that.
solved.
Except you have the choice to not do that if it's not correct to. You could discard something else, which is pure upside.
Anyway, so Hope Tender is great. It's a lot of fun. I think everyone should play it.
Yes, this is a perfect card, I think, that, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it exemplifies some of the things you're trying to accomplish with your cube.
Definitely. I mean, one of the big foundations of this cube is the lands. I really enjoy playing with bounce lands. I really enjoy...
Bounce lands are great in this cube. I mean, they're great overall. I do think in environments like mine, just on speed, it's not worth playing the tap land for that, draw land ability on it. But I think they're underrated in many other environments. I see people in lower powered cubes that are running check lands or fast lands or whatever when I think they'd be much better served power level wise by these bounce lands just because they think they're worse than they are because they were printed at common. They were commons, right?
Yeah, they should be rares. Like
Ridiculous.
all mana fix. Dear Wizards, here's the thing that you're doing wrong for me.
Uncommon? Maybe they were uncommon.
I think they must have been uncommon.
If they were, I think they might have been common because I think I've seen them in pauper cubes. But either way, ridiculous. I mean, truly broken, I think, in like retail limited and just really strong, I think, in most cube environments. It's a land that says draw a card on it, basically.
Yeah.
Which is pretty messed up.
So that's a big part of the cube design. There's a lot of these tap lands because I love them. I really wanted to make them shine in this cube. So because of that, I also don't have a ton of 1-drops because I don't want to really punish you for including some tap lands in your deck. Not that the bounce lands really fit into this rule because you're not going to play them on turn 1, hopefully.
It's a weird line for sure.
But that means Hope Tender is kind of like the dork that you're going to get. You're not going to get Llanowar Elves in this cube. You can
Right.
get a 2-mana dork.
Right, and that's my point, is that this is to me, this exemplifies a lot of what you're trying to accomplish with your cube, because you don't have just a 2-mana dork that taps for any color of mana. Instead, you have
Right.
Hope Tender, which has all of this extra possibility attached to it. All of this, like, draft play specifically, and you can get a much higher ceiling than a 2-mana dork, but also has a lower floor, right? Sometimes it doesn't tap for mana at all, and you just maybe can't use it to advance your own strategy necessarily. It's interesting because playing against it, and, you know, I'll admit I was a little salty. Because it was our first time playing, I feel like for a little while, all of my chances to play Paper Magic are going to be imbued with a little too much importance because it's been so long since we played Paper Magic.
Yeah, it's fair.
And I wish I was the kind of person that I could just say, like, oh, it's so special, I'm going to just enjoy it. But in reality, I'm like, I want to get the most maximum joy out of my time playing Magic and not waste anything. And yeah, I was a little salty to get paired up in round 2, and a little salty to be dying to mana screw over and over again, which I think I announced at the beginning of the draft was going to happen to me, but it did in fact come true.
You can always see mana screw if you're looking for it.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of it. The games I lost to mana screw were not awful. It wasn't like I had no lands and was just dead. It was like it took me 3 or 4 turns to find my 3rd or 4th land, and then by that time I was like well enough behind that couldn't really come back. They were like slow deaths to mana screw, not you have no lands, you lose, there's no game kind of mana screw. Either way, I was sitting there thinking about Hope Tender, Anthony. I was having some complicated feelings about Hope Tender. And I think this is why I like talking about Cube, with you especially, because I think we do have very different approaches to the game and approaches to cube design, because Hope Tender is the kind of card I wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole in my cube, right? I don't think that's a surprise.
No, definitely not.
And why would you say that is? Like, if you, I described why you like the card and fit your goals. Why do you think it doesn't fit my goals?
I mean, just on raw power level, it doesn't get there, and I it's hard for me to see beyond that.
Okay, so how about this? So let's look at this is a card I'm just going to actually ask you if you considered. Have you ever looked at Magus of the Candelabra?
Interesting. I haven't considered that, but
so that's a 1-mana creature. It's an 0/1, I believe, and it has the Candelabra of Tawno's ability. So pay X and tap it to untap X target lands, which is very similar, I think, to Hope Tender, with an even higher ceiling theoretically, because if you have 3 or 4 bounce lands like you had in play in this deck, you can generate 8 mana with it instead of 3. Magus of the Candelabra might be on power level for my cube if I had some of these bounce lands or something. But the real reason I don't want to play those kinds of cards is because I am obsessed with the floor, right? I'm a floor obsessed cube curator, and the idea of playing some of these cards in what is effectively a mana dork role that sometimes won't be mana dorks just kills me. I just can't bring myself to do it.
I mean, it's interesting that you say that, because I think that actually in my cube, in regular cube, the Hope Tender has the much, much higher floor, because Magus, you need something to do with it.
Oh, it does have a higher floor, because Magus is a useless body.
Magus does nothing.
Yeah.
Hope Tender can ramp you. It's a high cost. It's not super efficient, but if you need that, 4th mana to be able to play something and stay on the board, it can do that.
Right, you can just exert it even if you have no bounce, is what you're saying.
And it's also a creature that it's a cube where creatures matter. Having reasonable bodies matters, and Hope Tender, it turns out, is a 2/2. So worst case scenario, a 2-mana 2/2 does something in this environment.
Sure. And actually, the card I actually really, really wanted to compare it to is Devoted Druid, which is a card I do run.
So Devoted Druid is an interesting comparison. It's a 2-mana 0/2, taps for green, and you can put a -1/-1 counter on it to untap it. So you can similarly just get this burst of speed. It's obviously different because it does just generate mana on its own,
right?
But it can do that double mana in 1 turn.
Yeah. So the difference here is that it doesn't require the drafting and building around of having tap lands for the baseline of producing mana. It just produces mana every turn if you want to, though at a pretty below rate for my environment. I have lots of 1-mana mana dorks, so as a 2-mana 0/2 that just taps for green, Devoted Druid looks pretty bad. But I really like the card for that ability of being able to once hit it with a -1/-1 counter and produce 2 green mana in a turn, just to ramp right to 4, right on turn 3 or something. Or I guess right to 5 on turn 3 if you still have your land drop, which is pretty powerful. And the thing I realized when watching you spend, 3 to 4 minutes figuring out how much mana you could actually make with Hope Tender.
That's on me. I had some confusing lines.
I don't think that's on you. I mean, I think that's part of the complexity of your cube, I think. I mean, I don't think it's on you, the player, for like not being able to figure it out. I think it was very complicated to figure out what those lines were going to look like.
Yeah, I mean, part of it also, we've talked about a little bit about heuristics and shortcuts, and there's some easy shortcuts with Hope Tender. Like, okay, if I have regular lands, I can exert it to generate 1 mana. If I have a bounce land, I can now generate 2 mana.
But you had like 3 bounce lands of different colors, and you're like, can I get double whatever?
Colors,
yeah. So anyway, while I was sitting there and you were doing all that mana math, trying to figure out how much mana you could produce with Hope Tender, I was thinking that it clarified a goal of mine for my cube, which I think is different from your goals, and I'm curious to unpack this a little bit, which is that I love build-arounds as much as anybody, I think. I think it's really fun to have cards, and we've talked about this at length, that change in value based on what you've already drafted prior in the pack, right? Like, they interact with cards in your deck, and they behave differently in different contexts, and have that ability for you to draft and play savvily to make them better or worse. And Hope Tender fits that description perfectly in the regular cube. However, I don't like that from my enablers. I don't want my removal, my cantrips, my ramp to be conditional on some of these other details. I like to have a good baseline where, like, I know my deck is an effective ramp deck, or I know my deck is an effective Xerox deck, or I know my deck is an effective control deck, it's got lots of removal spells, and where I'm willing to have those build-arounds is that higher mana value things, threats, that kind of stuff, and less on those enablery cards. Is that something you've ever thought about, or do you kind of see no distinction really between cards that enable versus pay off for those strategies?
Yeah, I mean, so if you're looking at this particular setup,
Right.
Are the bounce lands the enabler, or is the Hope Tender the enabler, or is the expensive thing you're casting with it? Like, I feel like all those pieces kind of fit together. Like, you want to be playing the bounce lands already. You want to have a couple expensive threats usually in this cube. So I don't know if I understand exactly how it fits into that framework.
So the card I'm talking about specifically is the Hope Tender, and the fact that it needs bounce lands in this case to be turned into a dork, traditionally speaking, is one example of a way to like turn it on. Like it's an example of that conditionality, conditionalness that I try to avoid in my enablers. Like, I just don't want my ramp creature to not ramp me sometimes, right? Because I didn't happen to draw my bounce land. That's all the enabler, and then the payoff is whatever you cast with it, right? And that's not the question here. Like, whatever, that's a different question we could talk about. Otherwise, whether you cast an Archfiend of Ifnir or a big Planeswalker or whatever, that's a different question. But what I'm saying is, it occurred to me that I was trying to think in my head, like, why don't I like this? Why don't I like what's happening to me right now with this Hope Tender? Why is this not sparking joy? I think the reason was that it felt like it was a card that, as it performed in your deck, it was kind of broken. Like, you were tapping it for 3 mana. It was a 2 mana Mandork that tapped for 3 and just felt above power level for the cube because you drafted this little internal synergy.
Sure.
Which I think is your goal, right?
Yeah. I mean, I see what you're saying. I'm not as sure about the sort of like enabler versus payoff thing. I'm gonna have to think about that more. But what I definitely do enjoy is like these small little packages of like little cards that fit together. So it's not just like.
And to your point, those cards are both good on their own.
Right.
Though I gotta admit, and this is maybe just my like familiarity bias, I'm skeptical of the value of Hope Tender without any bounce lands.
For sure. I mean, I would agree it's like a C-. Like, it's not, it's gonna be cut most of the time, but it's still viable. It's not like a complete throwaway.
It's 2 mana 2/2, so
it's not like having Pestermite in your vintage cube draft if you
or
don't
Magus
have
of the
Kiki-Tiki,
Candelabra
or
in your
Magus
deck
of the,
with no non-basic lands.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to have that conversation without talking about power level a little bit, because definitely the fact that it has an okay floor does a lot for me. But I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this other cube design that it has this rarity, and I've been thinking a lot about the draft formats that I really, really have enjoyed in the past. And it really is things like Modern Horizons. That's the one that I'm thinking of, right?
Is it? I'm not sure. You like Ultimate Masters a lot.
Yeah, Modern Horizons, Ultimate Masters, even like Masters 25. And
it's kind of funny to me that you, as somebody who is always espousing the lower powered Magic cards, really love the super high powered draft formats. These are all Masters
sets. I think that what is appealing to me is not the power level, because as we all know, the numbers don't matter.
They're all made up. Yep.
They're all made up. Power level within the environment doesn't really exist. But the other feature of those environments is the high complexity and these lots of little packages. And like, again, like listening to LSV talk about Time Spiral Remastered and talk about like, well, this card's pretty bad. You probably don't want it to be in your deck unless you have this other card. It's like, oh, there's all these little combos seeded through, and they're not like win the game on the spot, but they're enough to really
turn
like,
your 2 mana dork into
exactly,
much better mana dork.
And those kinds of little interactions, like that level of build around and having a lot of them available to you at once in one draft environment, is really really exciting to me.
Yeah, I guess it's part of the thesis there that you have enough of those that even though the likelihood, I mean, even if you have 3 bounce lands, right, the chance of assembling, we could do the math on it, the chance of actually drawing and assembling Hope Tender and a bounce land can't be super high in the average draft deck, I would imagine.
Yeah.
So is the idea that you have so many of these little overlapping things that
You'll have something fun happen every game.
That you'll have some way to generate value outside of, but you'll have some way to combine cards such that they are worth more than the sum of their parts in every game, whether it's Hope Tender and bounce lands or, think of another combination like that in your cube.
Archfiend of Ifnir and a cycling card.
I don't know if that counts because Archfiend is just so good on its own.
Or if you get, Sai and you're able to chain a bunch of artifacts together, or your Gravecrawler and a couple of zombies.
Gravecrawler and a couple zombies is another good example because you don't have so many zombies that I would say that like Zombie Tribal is an on-rails deck. You just have some incidental zombies and a couple zombie matters cards such that you're not going to be able to draft a deck that every single time it goes off zombie style, but you'll be able to draft a deck that has enough of these combinations that you'll eventually be able to have some kind of overlapping synergy.
Yeah, I mean, we're maybe going a little bit off topic and a little bit deep into this particular cube design.
We can't go off topic on our Cube podcast talking about Cube. That's what podcasts are all about.
Okay, fine. Here we go. So somebody else made the comment who hadn't drafted this cube before, like, well, XYZ cards all feel a little bit undersupported. And I definitely get where they're coming from, where they're used to saying, like, yep, this...
Did you hear me defend you when they said that?
I really appreciated that.
I jumped in there. I defended you so hard.
You did a great job.
Thank you.
Where you're used to saying, like, oh yeah, here's this like signpost card, and if you go all into the spells matters, the artifact matters deck, then all the pieces are there and you're gonna have it. And I really I've been trying to get to that point where it's like, this card is medium bad. If you can draft around it a little bit, it gets pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
Not just like, there is the XY deck, and if you draft all in, you will get there. And I think that's pretty successful overall. Like, Traxos, not that hard to build around. It's not busted, but it's solid.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of broken when you do it right.
It's kind of broken.
Traxos has ended a lot of games in this cube for me where I'm like, well, I have no answer to a 4-mana 7/7 with Vigilance that you can just keep smashing me with.
Yeah, that one maybe should get on the watch list because they keep printing more and more legends.
Well, but I like it. I like that it's good in your cube.
Yeah. What other cube is Traxos like one of the bombs?
I'm sure they exist. I'm sure they're out there, but it is the kind of card, like, I think Traxos was tabling late in our draft because it was pack 3 and just nobody was in that deck, which is just going to happen sometimes. That's like the trade-off for running these cards. That Traxos in particular, I mean, I guess it's just does it come into play tapped?
Yeah.
Okay, so you can't just play it as a 4-mana 7/7 blocker without any other artifacts in your deck. You need some way to untap it the first time.
Yeah, I mean, in the specific card, one of the specific cards that was mentioned was Joy or a Weatherlight Captain, which, yeah, like, that is definitely a little bit of a pet card of mine. But also a 4-mana 3/3 that if it draws you a card, you're in pretty good shape. If it draws you 2 cards, you're in great shape. So, yeah, I mean, those are the kinds of, like, levels of small build around that I really appreciate.
Yeah, and this, I guess, gets more at, in detail, why I'm so bad at drafting these kinds of formats, because I'm so not used to thinking about my decks in that regard. Like, when I'm drafting, I'm always thinking about, like, what are the decks I'm going to face and how do I have answers for what they're going to be doing. And the answer, I think, I've learned over many years of drafting your cube, is often, like, make your deck better than theirs. Like, combine your cards in a way that it's just better than theirs, right? And it doesn't really matter what they're doing because what you're doing is just better than what they're doing. And so they can be doing their Hope Tender nonsense, but you're doing your Gravecrawler, Carrion Feeder nonsense, and that's just better than what they're doing. And so it doesn't matter that you don't have to directly interact with that strategy. You just kind of eclipse it, and I think that's part of what happens.
Yeah, that's a little bit extreme. I don't think this cube is anywhere close to 2 people playing solitaire every game.
No, I didn't mean to imply that. I mean, there is plenty of interaction, and a lot of the complexity in your cube is just interaction in combat because you have less removal, more conditional removal, and so you're oftentimes just having to navigate more cluttered boards and figure out how you're going to break through. But I do think that from a drafting perspective, like, I'm always thinking through that lens of, like, what am I going to do against an aggro deck? What am I going to do against a control deck? What am I going to do against a deck that's got, like, just more 2-for-1s than me? How am I going to beat them? And in that mess gets lost this idea of, like, ooh, I have my Hope Tender. Let me take some more bounce lands. Or
treat yourself. Have a good time.
Yeah, I'm so bad at looking for that. I'm not attuned to looking for those things in the draft, which is a hole of mine I need to patch. That's interesting. It was interesting for me to clarify that detail of, like, when I was happy to have complexity and conditional cards, and it's when we're talking about, like, a big payoff or, like, a game-ending thing or, like, a threat. And where I'm not having additional stuff is on like all of the things that set up and prepare me and like get my deck to the point where I'm able to put myself in that position. I guess I am I'm so focused on consistency in when I draft and how my cube is built that like I want my strategy to be a deck-wide strategy where like this deck always does to some degree or another the thing it's meant to do. And it feels like with these little interactive synergies, a lot of times it's like, well, based on the hand I drew, now my deck is doing this game. And if I draw a different hand next game, my deck will do something slightly different. I'm just not used to that.
Right, and I would say, like, for me as a player, of course I want a more consistent deck that can perform and do the thing it's supposed to do. But if I am given the deck that can't do that, I think I'm going to enjoy that gameplay more when every game is a little bit different and I have to navigate a novel hand, a novel board state, and, you know, make the most out of cards that might not fit together perfectly. Like, that's a lot more fun for me.
Interesting. I don't find there's any shortage of novel board states, even with a very focused deck. Especially in Singleton. I feel like there's always still lots of decisions to make there.
Everything is a spectrum.
Let's do our Pack One Pick One square in the middle of this episode. We had a nice little intro topic there talking about Hope Tender and build around cards, whether they're payoffs or enablers. Let's go to our Pack One Pick One, though. This week, we have a cube sent to us by Simon. And Anthony, this cube is a little bit buck wild.
Looks pretty normal to me.
This cube is called Cubus Color Correctus. I'm not even sure where that name came from, and it is a small cube, only 120 cards. The aim of the cube is to totally upend card evaluation and make you think about cards in a different context, which I think it succeeds at doing, and the way it succeeds at doing that is by changing the rules of the game. So, the rules are that cards may all be cast for their mana value, so you can ignore color when casting all the cards in your deck, which is cool. If you pay the correct mana cost, colors and all, then you get to copy the spell as you're casting it, which is also nuts. But you only get wastes as basic lands at the end of the draft. So you're not going to be able to draft a mono red deck and put a bunch of mountains in to double all your red spells. You're going to have to draft non-basic lands in the actual draft portion that produce red mana. And from looking at the list, Anthony, we see that the lands that do produce colored mana are asking a lot of you to do so. We have like these charge lands, depletion lands that produce colored mana, but at a pretty steep cost. Like a Guildgate would be welcome here, and instead we have these other more intensive options. Then finally, the draft is 3 packs of 10, meant to be drafted with 4 players, I gather from the cube size, and the minimum deck size is 30 cards, so a slightly smaller deck in addition to all of its other complexity. Dare I ask, Anthony, how are you going to approach drafting this list? Is there anything you're looking for in a pack that you're excited to take early, or anything you're really trying to avoid given these novel rules?
That's a really good question. So it is an extremely, extremely novel cube. I've never played a cube like this, and I would love to play it. I'm so curious how it plays out. The first thing I immediately look to after reading the rules is, what are the sort of like costs of these spells actually look like? Are we seeing a lot of like double pips, or are things pretty splashable? And overall, it's pretty much just things with 1 pip. So
yep, that's true.
That means, okay, maybe this idea of, so it's kind of like a desert cube in that we don't get basic lands that aren't wastes. Like we still get wastes, but we're not going to be able to put whatever colors of mana. So I can't just say, I'm going to draft a black deck and only take black cards and I'll be able to copy everything. If I want to be able to copy things, I need to have drafted black lands as well.
Yeah.
So that kind of put me into thinking, I want to see what's splashable and figure out how can I make my deck as efficient as possible, just sort of ignoring colors, have a theme, have a strategy, and then maybe focus on 1 or 2 colors for cards that I expect to copy. And I think based on the types of lands here, the things that I want to copy are going to be some more expensive things because I'm going to want to have my charge counters and stuff like that. So I think that where that lands me is in this kind of like really weird space of, I want to draft a deck with a plan that cheap cards can be whatever, be sort of like focused, be aggressive, proactive, and then maybe in the expensive cards get a little like more focused in terms of color, but a little splashier in terms of what they do.
Yeah, the first thing I looked for was just at the lands in general, just to see what it was going to look like to have these fixing lands in my deck.
Yeah, because that makes a huge difference. Like you said, if they were Guildgates, that would be a totally different draft experience, I think.
Yeah, and so we have what looks like a full cycle of these storage lands. For people that might not know these are dual lands that come into play untapped, but they tap for a colorless mana, and then you can pay 1 and tap them to put a storage counter on them, and then you can pay 1 and remove X storage counters to produce X mana in any combination of the 2 colors of the land, which means that you're going to have to play this land, you're going to have to pay a mana for it, and tap it. So it's basically, not only does it come into play tap, but it taps another land in the process, essentially. And then on the next turn, you can convert some mana into a mana of that color. So really, really intensive and asking a lot of you to produce that colored mana. These lands can be quite powerful in really glacially slow environments because they do end up ramping essentially after you've dumped just all kinds of mana into them over the first couple turns of the game. You can, in fact, pay 1, remove 4 charge counters, and get a big burst of mana out of them. But it takes a really long time. You're going to be way behind on the tempo of that game before you can get there. They also have these depletion lands, which are also dual lands. They come into play untapped and tap for either color, which is cool, but when you tap them for a color, they get a depletion counter, which basically locks them down until your next untap step. And they don't have the option to tap for colorless, so these lands basically all exert themselves as dual lands, which is also pretty high cost. We have I'm not sure what the cycle is called, but the cycle that Faculos Lowlands and Rootwater Depths are part of, which tap for a colorless and then similarly can tap for either color and then just freeze themselves down during the next untap phase. Those, I think, strictly better than the other lands. Am I correct? I think the Lowlands and Rootwater Depths are strictly better than River Delta and Landcap.
It definitely lets you play a very proactive strategy. These lands kind of exert themselves. Maybe we should just call these the Hope Tender lands.
There you go, the Hope Tender lands. So those are the kind of fixing lands we're dealing with. Nothing really great in terms of fixing, which I think is clearly a design decision, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's a huge part of it. Like, when I looked at this and, like, the idea of you can copy your spells, that's so much value. Like, the difference between
a ton of value.
Copying all of your spells and not copying all of your spells is cutting the power of your deck in half. So the fact that you
maybe even more.
Very possibly more. It's hard to measure these things.
It's like how, 2 mana is a lot less than half of 4 mana when it comes to Magic, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. So the fact that these lands are actually much slower actually, I think, makes that a reasonable tension where it's not just like, okay, I'm going to draft this basic island, because putting a basic island in play is like, like it is in all of Magic, the most powerful card in this cube.
Should we dive into our pack one pick one then, Anthony?
Yeah, I would just say, like, but before we get too deep into it, like, I really enjoy this design. Like, with the Turbo Cube, I was doing something similar where it's like, hey, people think they like broken magic. They like extremely powerful spells.
You were trying to prove a point. You were on a mission. Oh, you think you like this?
You think
this is fun? And turns out, Anthony, it is really fun. The Turbo Cube is super fun. Just taking lots of game actions is very fun.
Right, and that's what copying spells is fun.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I appreciate saying, like, you don't have to have a higher power level. Or it's not that the only way to have a higher power level is to buy more expensive cards. You can just change the rules of the game.
Yeah, and then you too can take many game actions in one turn.
You can take so many game actions. So I'm ready to take some game actions.
All right, here we go. I'll hit you with this pack. So again, this is a pack of 10, of which we get to draft 3 and then build a deck of 30 cards, which I guess we should also briefly talk about that. I'm expecting to play between like 10 and 12 lands in my 30-card deck.
Yeah, you sort
probably
of can
closer to 12.
Stick to the same ratio, if you divide 17 by 40 and then scale that down to 30, except you want to then edge a little bit lower land count because you end up seeing more of your deck in your opening hand.
Right, yeah.
So whatever that math comes out to.
My baseline, my comparison point for the 30-card decks is my Combat Trick Cube is 24-card decks, and those decks are all pretty low to the ground and proactive with low mana curves, and I find that I pretty much always want to play 8 lands in those decks. So I think probably closer to 12, actually, for a 30-card deck is going to be about right. So 18 playables out of the 30 cards we're going to draft. Here's our pack, though, Anthony. All That Glitters, Foundry Inspector, Mere Battlesphere, Peregrine Drake, Telling Time, Manglehorn, Profit and Loss, Saltwood Step, Warlord's Fury, and a quarter Paladin. What are you looking at, buddy?
Okay, before we actually... I need to ask a judge question before I answer about this.
Judge!
So here's a question. If I have a bunch of waste in my deck... I thought the judge was here.
Okay, Judge is here. Sure.
So, Judge, if I cast this Foundry Inspector, do I have to tap 3 wastes in order to get a copy of it?
Yes.
Okay, so
the rules I think pretty clearly clarify that you cannot use colored mana as generic mana and still get the benefit of cloning a spell.
Okay, that makes sense. That's kind of what I expected. That being said, I'm still pretty deep on Foundry Inspector.
Tell me more. Well, first of all, Foundry Inspector, 3 mana, 4/3/2 that says artifact spells you cast cost 1 generic mana less to cast. Now, here we need another judge call.
Okay.
Do I still get to copy it if it costs 1 less to cast? I didn't pay the actual mana cost of that card anymore.
No, I think you did. The cost of the spell.
Spell or card? I think the overview of the draft says let's see.
That wouldn't be fun. That wouldn't be fun. I
gonna assume the spirit of the rule.
The spirit of this cube designer. They're trying to have a good time, and they wouldn't take that from us.
I'm expecting. Let's assume they aren't either. Yes.
Okay. So I actually don't really care about the text in this card. I think that copying your spells is insane. This is not a 3-mana 3/2 with some text. This is a 3-mana 2 3/2s with potentially some text.
Yeah.
Everything else here is gonna be a lot harder to copy. So that's the end of my story.
I am in strong agreement with you. And the thing that did it in for me was that so many of the non-basic lands also just tap for colorless.
Right, exactly, yeah.
My first thought was that there might be this tension in this environment between, I'm going to play some colored spells. There's not enough colorless spells that you're going to play a fully devoid deck. There's not actually that many colorless spells in this cube. So you're going to have to be playing some colors, which means I'm going to have to be playing some non-basic lands to cast those spells and clone them, because I'm not going to be happy, I don't think, not cloning any of my spells if that's something that can be done in this environment. I think I'm like, similar to my first point in last week's episode. If there's a broken thing to do, I want to be doing it. Like, I want to be the one copying Pirate's Pillage if that's the thing that could be done in this cube. So I'm going to be playing as non-basic lands. If those non-basic lands only produce colored mana and not colorless mana, then I would not reliably be able to clone my Foundry Inspector on turn 3. I would be, perhaps stuck with these non-basic lands that didn't produce colorless and just stuck with a regular Foundry Inspector. But given that so many of them do, I'm in strong agreement with you that I think Foundry Inspector is the pick here. My second pick would be Mere Battlesphere, because it is, again, a colorless card. It's at 7 mana. Making 2 Mere Battlespheres is very likely going to end the game. And there's a non-trivial amount of ramp in this environment. There's all of the full cycle of the colored mirror mana dorks at 2 mana, so Lead Mirror, Iron Mirror, Gold Mirror, all those mirrors. We have Gilded Lotus, and also, this might be the kind of environment where just playing a storage land and then ramping it up for a couple turns and dropping a somewhat ahead of schedule cloned Mere Battlesphere. Actually, you can't in that case, because you get it wouldn't be cloned.
You can't use
Well, I'll just have a regular early Mere Battlesphere. I guess I'll settle for that. They might be good enough in this particular environment.
I mean, so if we're going to go back to last week's episode where we talked about sort of how we evaluate a new environment, one of the next things we look for is speed. And that's the thing that is so hard for me to evaluate here, because...
Oh, yeah. It's one of the hardest things in a normal cube list, and here, when people can potentially clone their Quarter Paladin, I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah. So I don't know, like, there's so many variables here that it makes it really hard to evaluate just from looking at the list and trying to sort of grok the rules. Battlesphere is insane. It's definitely a more powerful card, but the fact that, even let's ignore the fact that people can clone a Quarter Paladin, just the fact that you can just build an aggro deck of all 5 colors and curve out reliably every time. I think that there might be decks that can actually just put you under a lot of pressure.
That is true. I will say that it's a small cube. There's not a ton of creatures. Many of them are not really designed to attack. So I think while that's possible, I'm not sure that even if you did curve out reliably and had a great curve of creatures, like 1-drops, there are 3 in the whole cube. Well, I guess it's Bonded Construct. There's 4 in the whole cube. It's Llanowar Elves, Cerulean Caretaker, which has no power and Defender, Bonded Construct, and Fairy Imposter. I'll take playing one of those on turn 1 rather than doing nothing on turn 1 if I'm playing an aggressive deck, but none of those are really going to do a lot for me. I mean, I guess Bonded Construct does the most, theoretically, but nothing really with haste otherwise. I don't know either. In summary, speed is one of the hardest things to evaluate just from looking at a list, and especially with these dramatic rules changes, I have no idea what to expect. I have no idea how fast this environment might be.
But a 3-mana 2 3/2s is going to deal with most proactive decks pretty well.
Oh, yeah. That's going to... Double Foundry Inspector on turn 3 is going to shut them down pretty quick.
Feeling pretty good about that. So the other thing that does stand out for me, though, if Foundry Inspector or another cheap artifact wasn't here, I think is, well, Telling Time and also Salt Crusted Step. I think Telling Time for that reason that in the late game, if I, spend the time to charge up a storage land, being able to draw a bunch of cards off of it is going to be an extremely powerful way to sort of recoup some value if I, spent some early turns not copying spells. And the storage lands, I really just don't know how highly to take, and I wouldn't be surprised if, in the long run, the time-traveling supercomputer would tell us that Salt Crust Step is actually the pick here, and it wasn't close.
Yeah, I have no idea how highly to rate lands in general in this environment, though I will say that of all the lands, I think the storage lands are among the worst, I think, for me.
Interesting.
Because
I feel like the fact that they generate colorless mana is actually very relevant.
Most of them do, though, is the thing. Like the other lands, like, for example, the Thakalos Lowlands cycle, I think is much better, and also just taps for colorless mana. So Yes, I just don't think the storage lands are the ones I'm most excited about of the lands. Though it might be correct to take a land here in general. Maybe the correct thing to do is just have lots of different dual lands in your deck and take the first couple turns off because you're playing tap lands and weird slow mana, but then just start casting double of all the spells in your deck. I will say my initial impression is I think I'm kind of low on that, and for me, it's Foundry Inspector's pretty clearly the pick. I think the next thing I would do is take a Quarter Paladin because boy, do I want to play a clone to Quarter Paladin on turn 2. That's going to feel really, really good.
A Quarter Paladin was probably the second thing that stood out to me as well, but the more we've been having this conversation, I'm
You're
kind
just
of
worried about
away.
your opponent playing 2 Foundry Inspectors on their turn 3?
And that makes me much more excited to take the telling time.
All right, well, Simon, that cube's buck wild, and I appreciate you sending it in. We are always happy to look at really off the beaten path cubes. You know, we've talked about the Turbo Cube, the Mono Black Cube, the Degenerate Micro Cube. You know, we celebrate odd cubes here. I think it's part of the beauty of cubing. So I would love to know, Simon, if you think we did okay on this back one pick one. As somebody with some experience with this environment, how off are we? But we're both starting with Foundry Inspector, and I think we're pretty happy about it. If you want to have your cube on Lucky Paper Radio, mail it to mail@luckypaper.co with your name and your pronouns, and we will do it on the show. I got one more little mini topic here, Anthony.
All right, hit me.
Actually, I have one mini topic and then one mini issue to settle.
Okay,
Which one
sure.
do you want first?
Let's finish on an issue.
All right. Mini
We'll
topic.
take it to the complaints department at the end.
Mini topic. I don't want to talk too much about Modern Horizons 2 because we do not have the full spoilers. We're recording this on Thursday, May 27th. I'm sure by the time this comes out on Monday, there'll be many more notable spoilers, so I don't want to talk broadly about the set yet. But today we did have Ragavan Nimble Pilferer spoiled, which is a card a lot of cube designers are excited about, myself included. And I'll talk about the card briefly, but really I want to talk about it because, like the playing against Hope Tender, I think it's clarified for me, allowed me to better articulate where I'm happy to have really powerful cards in my cube. So first, Ragavan is a single red mana for a legendary creature, Monkey Pirate, and it is a 2/1. That's already pretty great as far as red aggressive bodies are concerned. We usually get 2/1s with downside in red, so already pretty excited about that.
Are you going to be upset when you finally cut Jackal Pups from your cube?
I don't have Jackal Pup in my cube.
Never mind, moving on.
I was a little upset when I cut it because it was a nice old foil,
Yeah, fair.
but I did what I did. You know, you gotta serve the cube. But instead of downsides, Ragavan has multiple upsides. So Ragavan has a triggered ability. Whenever Ragavan Nimble Pilferer deals combat damage to a player, create a treasure token and exile the top card of that player's library until end of turn. You may cast that card. Importantly, it does not say you may spend mana of any color to cast it. So you're going to have to use those treasure tokens to fix your mana or just have the mana available to cast that card, which is slightly different than perhaps people might see at first read. And then, even better, this card has Dash for 1 and a red. And Dash is the ability where you can put it into play with haste for the Dash cost and then return it to your hand at the end of turn. This is a ridiculously pushed red 1-drop. Lots of conversations on various Discords today about it being better than Goblin Guide, better than Lightning Bolt maybe. I'm not ready to make those kinds of comparisons. I'm not ready to compare apples to oranges or apples to
Monkeys
breakfast
to goblins?
cereal or monkeys to goblins. But it's
Can
certainly
we just call him Questing Monkey?
Sure. Well, see, no, I'm not willing to do that because you're making the comparison to Questing Beast, which is a card with a ton of rules text that was pushed in a lot of ways. But I didn't like Questing Beast, and I, in fact, just cut it from my cube because I didn't like the design so much. I thought it was so inelegant, just because it felt like there was no rhyme or reason for all those abilities, and it was hard to remember them all because they weren't connected. They weren't flavorfully connected. Ragavan makes sense to me. Like, he's a little monkey. He steals stuff. He finds treasure. Like, it makes total sense. It's just very pushed and powerful. I'm really excited about this card. I can't wait to put it in my cube and do stupid stuff with it. But I had the thought, Anthony, that we talked about Laelia a little bit on our set review for Commander 2021 and Strixhaven.
Yeah, it's interesting. This card feels kind of similar in that it's the 1-mana version of a dumb red card you just play is all upside and it never stops and it takes the game over.
Yes, right? I had this exact same thought. I was like, I did not like Laelia because I felt like it asked nothing of my drafters and was just kind of stupidly pushed in a way that it's just correct to take it, put it in your deck, play it and swing, and there's not really... It doesn't... What I ended up writing in my little review when I tentatively added it to my cube for testing was that I didn't think it would stick around because I don't think it contributes at all to the deck diversity or matchup diversity or matchup spread. It's just like powerful card that any deck that can play will cast it and be happy. And perhaps contrary to maybe what you would say, I don't think there are very many of those cards in my cube that are like that. I don't think it's very many cards that if you're in this color, you just take it and play it and are thrilled no matter what.
No, I mean, the power level is pretty tight. Like, you have to build a focused, tight deck, so it doesn't.
And you also
there's not
need
a lot of space
you need
for
to
that.
balance things, right? Like, I have a lot of cantrips, and, some of the
Right.
better cantrips, like any blue deck will play Ponder. Sure. Any red deck will play Lightning Bolt. But they fill a particular slot in your deck, and you have to, like, balance how much you have of card selection and Xeroxy cantrips versus removal and threats. And you have to, like, keep all these things in balance. And it just felt like, compared to other red 3s for that slot, this Laelia was just kind of dumb pushed stats. It just drew cards. It did everything, right? Ragavan also does everything. Ragavan also, under best case circumstances, ramps, draws cards, while also dealing damage to your opponent at what is right next to the most aggressive rate. If it had haste, it would be tied for all time with creatures that just deal damage in terms of raw power for their mana cost. But the reason I'm excited about Ragavan and not excited about Laelia, I think I've clarified down to this. I'm very happy to have power outliers at extremely low mana values. So really powerful cards, like this card for 1 mana does so much. If this card costs 2 mana, I think it'd be kind of bad, right? Like, this would be maybe playable at 2 mana still for the dash ability, but it would be considerably worse, right? Like, we'd be having a conversation about, is this card even playable? Not, why is this card so broken?
Yeah, I mean, like, what's the Direfleet Daredevil? Is that the one that steals cards from your opponent's graveyard?
Yes, I believe so. The one that I keep thinking has Flash, and in fact made that mistake
does
in
not.
my game this weekend.
It is not quite Snapcaster Mage.
That'd be
But
pretty
yeah,
cool
I mean,
if
then it would be
was.
similar to that, and that card, I put that in my cube. It's
That card also got First Strike, though.
pretty
It doesn't have
powerful,
First Strike.
fair.
So the reason I'm happy to have really powerful cards at 1 mana is even though this card is very pushed for its mana value, for its overall investment, it still loses out to tons of cards in my cube, right? Like, it dies to literally any removal. It dies to a stiff wind. It's got 1 toughness, no protection, just dies. It's got no evasion. Any blocker with 3 toughness just eats it for lunch. So even though it's a really powerful card, it doesn't really actually stand the risk of taking over the game unless your opponent is a ham sandwich and does nothing. Or unless you build a deck that could back this up with equipment, removal spells, ways to continue getting through once they have blockers, with all of those other things you have to do in a good aggro deck to continue getting value from it. And for that reason, I'm really happy to have this power outlier on a low level because it doesn't actually represent, in terms of raw impact on the game, that much power, right? Like, raw impact on the game is probably like half as powerful as Laelia, or a third as powerful as Laelia. But Laelia, costing 3 more mana, like, is worth it, right? She's worth it for that bigger impact on the game. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, the fact that it is answerable in a way that I don't know how to pronounce the other card.
Laelia.
Laelia is just not answerable in the same way, and the longer she goes unanswered, the more unanswerable she gets. So
Right.
it just doesn't lead to, in my opinion, for like my taste, it doesn't lead to really great gameplay.
Yeah. And I think Ragavan will be similarly swinging, right? Because, like, Ragavan is not better in any situations where a regular 1 mana 2/1 like a Savannah Lion is bad, right? Like, 1 mana 2/1s are good when your opponent has no blockers, and they're usually bad as soon as they have any blockers. And that's true of this as well. The dash makes it a little better because you have the opportunity to, like, I can't wait to have, like, 5 lands in play, my opponent board wipes, and then I dash in Ragavan, and I get my treasure token, and I get to cast card off the top of their library. That's going to feel...
It's such flavorful.
It's going to feel so
such
good.
flavor.
Yeah, you blew up my whole pirate ship, but then there's Ragavan in the wreckage coming to get you. So the dash does make a difference there. But generally, like, when a Savannah Lions is bad, Ragavan is also going to be bad. The difference is, when Ragavan is good, it's a lot better than a Savannah Lions. It's a Savannah Lions that draws you a card sometimes, let's be real, honestly only in the late game, and makes you a treasure, which is huge. I mean, you play this on turn 1, and your opponent has no blocker and no removal spell, you're going to get to play a 3-drop on turn 2 in your red deck while dealing 2 damage to them. It's like a Llanowar Elf that attacks for 2. It's nuts. So it is going to be swinging, because the games where it's good, it's going to be really good. But the reason I like that is because it fits into what I want my aggro decks to do, and this card still has tons of flaws, right? The flaw of Laelia is that if your opponent has a Disfigure or a Shock, basically, and uses it at instant speed because they had mana held up, then it looks kind of sus. If you get to attack with it, if you get to get out of range of removal, like, it just snowballs and becomes really uninteractive and really uninteresting, I think.
I mean, if you think that's sus, then turns out you like hexproof.
No, I don't like hexproof.
Exactly.
I don't get it. Explain
The
it.
fact that creatures are interactable is important.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Great. Okay.
So anyway, Ragavan really pushed. I personally, I'll put this on record right now. Some people are talking about this being, like, bannable in Legacy and Modern. I don't think because of all the things I just said, like, it's not better in any situations where a 1-mana 2/1 was already bad, except for the dash clause, and we already have Zergo Bellstriker to like test that, and Zergo Bellstriker has not been relevant to any of those formats. So I think it's really pushed, but I think it's really just a fun toy. Honestly, this card feels like it was designed for power optimized cubers. Like, I don't know who the audience is for this card otherwise. I mean, maybe it does some stuff in Modern and becomes a viable deck build around it, but that's really exciting. I'm pretty pumped about it.
Yeah, I mean, we shouldn't get into it, but Modern Horizons 2 does kind of feel like Cube Horizons a little bit.
I thought you were going to say Commander Horizons. I was going to flip this whole table
No,
with
I
all this
mean-
expensive recording equipment on it.
2020 was the year of Commander, and, we all took a year off from life, and 2021 is going to be the year of Cube.
Everybody get in the same space, breathe the same air. Yeah, you mentioned you were going to add a lot of cards from this. You specifically said your cubes were going to get shaken up a lot by Modern Horizons 2.
I think I just said they were going to be destroyed.
Destroyed. Maybe that was the word you chose. I am curious for us to do our set review and hear you explain why that is, because surely it must be like kind of incidental that Modern Horizons 2 happens to line up with your cube design goals, because you're not playing Power Optimized. Like, you're not like, hooray, Ragavan and Broken Card, can't wait to jam in my cube.
Goodness, no.
So it'll be interesting to see how it is that a set that most cube designers are excited about for being pushed in terms of power level also appeals to you with your cubes that are at lower power levels.
Yeah, I don't think it's a coincidence at all. I mean, like we've talked about before, Modern Horizons 1 was like the set that finally sort of kicked me into gear and turned like a pile of junky, like some random list into a cube, because there was enough sort of like glue that set offered that really crystallized it. And this might be the next step.
Some of the cards I'm most excited about from Modern Horizons 2 are just whatever simple effects we get that were a little too pushed for standard. Like, I still love like Scour All Possibilities and Fist of Flame. Those are two of my favorite cards from Modern Horizons 1, just because they're like clean, pretty powerful. They're not seeing play in internal formats or anything, but they're probably a little bit too questionable for standard, maybe. Yeah, I like those really clean effects that we get. So that's part of what I'm excited about. Those really clean commons we'll get on the last day of the full spoiler reveal when we see those clean
the common
commons.
spoilers. That's what I always look forward to.
So am I a hypocrite for not liking Laelia but liking Ragavan? And I want you to be honest with me. I come here for the honesty.
No, and even if you were, no one's here to judge. Everyone can enjoy magic
What if I'm asking
in their
to be
way.
judged? What if I like to be judged?
No, of course not. You like this cute, adorable monkey? Put him in your cube.
I really hope we get an old border version of this. I hope by the time this episode goes out, there already is an old border version of this spoiled. I'm going to check the spoilers right now to make sure it hasn't happened while we've been recording.
Old border, but with the legendary crown on top.
We will have more to say about Modern Horizons, surely. I'm already anticipating, Anthony, our longest and most involved set review of all time. I'm sure it's going to happen.
I'm going to try and convince you into making it a series of 4 episodes.
I'm going to try and convince you into recording it separately, but still releasing it as one episode. So there's a canonical URL for search engine purposes.
Okay.
All right.
Did you want to take a quick journey to the complaints department?
Oh, we got to settle some stuff. So we were off mic talking about the new green-white sword, the Sword of Hearth and Home. I should say, though, I'm not even sure that we have the official English translation. It might be that that's just how people have translated it from the Spanish preview card. I think it's Spanish. I haven't looked at it recently. And we got into a little discussion about whether or not, most of the Sword of X and Y, Sword of Fire and Ice, Sword of Body and Mind, it's very, very clear which of those descriptors in the card name refers to which color. Fire and Ice, red's fire, blue is ice, body and mind, green is body, blue is mind. It makes sense. Hearth and Home, I thought, was pretty obvious, and you also thought was obvious, but we thought the opposite things. Do you want to defend your position on this sort of Hearth and Home issue?
Hearth and Home are both just perfect words for Selesnya. I think they really identify what this color pair is about. It's about nature, but also about control and unity. It's about coming together and celebrating the bounty of nature. But green isn't about home. Green isn't close to home.
What? How not?
Because
Explain.
white is the color of home. It's about togetherness. It's about the structure. And what green brings is what comes to the hearth. It's about the food that you have.
Okay, see, I think Hearth and Home, white is clearly hearth, green is clearly home. And here's my argument.
Mm-hmm.
A hearth is a unnatural construction. It's a thing that humans have made, a human intervention on the world. It's evidence of society, of civilization, of actual nuclear families, and manifested in construction form. Anything construction related and thing related is always white. Home is a much more abstract idea. Home can mean a lot of things. You're saying home is, the food you bring to the table, but home could be anything. I agree the idea of home exists in both colors and could totally make sense. To me, the idea of hearth only makes sense in white because it's a human intervention. It's unnatural.
Just like a house.
A house isn't a home. The home can be your tribe.
Home is where
home
the
can be your
heart is.
tribe. It can be your homelands. It can be your whatever. Hearth, very clearly manufactured, unnatural.
I'm entirely unconvinced, but I think this just really goes to show why this is the best color pair, because it really is so harmonious.
Can we get Gavin Verhey to answer this question on Good Morning Magic for us?
We can try.
Do you think we have enough pull yet?
No.
Listeners, we need your help. Anthony doesn't think we have enough pull. We need to get an answer on which word is which in Sword of Hearth and Home. Also, we need to get an answer whether or not that's actually the translation, because it might not be.
I believe that is. I'm looking at
it's
English
official
version right here.
Oh, great, perfect. I'm glad that it's actually the translation. Otherwise, this whole fight would be for nothing. Instead, it's very important and not for nothing at all. It's super important.
Are you prepared to be unsatisfied? What if the answer is just, well, it sounded good and it kind of makes sense for that color pair? Here's two things.
I am certain it will not be that.
Okay.
I feel like I know enough about the people that make Magic to know that there's no way they would do that.
So what if you were designing this card? What two words would you use to exemplify this? Sort of tree and treacle?
Well, let's see. I did post this survey on Twitter, and Daniel Schneider, at Work Life Value on Twitter, and the owner of the Devoid Cube, said sort of flicker and Farsi, which I think is a lot cleaner. It just describes what happens there pretty clearly. I think Hearth and Home is a great name. It's actually one of the most beautiful. Just, it's kind of like cellar door, sort of Hearth and Home. Really,
sort of Hearth and Home.
Really falls off the tongue. So I like the name a lot. I just think it's very clear that it's, white and green, Hearth and Home.
I agree. It's very clear.
We will get to the bottom of this and have a follow-up on the next episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Everyone get on Twitter and help us bombard Wizards employees to answer our completely meaningless question. Because
we don't ask you to contribute to a Patreon. We don't subject you to ads. We just need one thing for you. Go bother Gavin Verhey.
Yes. We don't want your money. We just want an army of people to help us pester Gavin Verhey on command. That's all we dream of.
I think that'll do it.
That's it for Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you for tuning in. This time for real. I said this at the end of another episode. I had to edit it out. You never even heard this. We have updated cube map data, which I'm going to commit right now, thus making Anthony review my pull request tonight before he leaves town. I'm going to commit right now that updated map data is going to be on the website by the time this episode goes out on Monday. Thanks to everybody that was asking for updated cube data. We have to get it directly from Cube Cobra. They have to do some work on their end to generate it, so it's not super duper easy. It's not totally trivial, but it sounds like we have a monthly or semi-monthly process we're going to go through to get that data updated more regularly. So go check out the updated cube map, especially if you have made substantial changes to your cube since it was released in February, or maybe you just made a brand new cube since then. It wasn't even on the first map in the first place.
Okay, I'm going
to do a live on-air pull request review.
GitHub, jeez, open pull. It's funny here. I think I have more pull requests waiting for review than you do.
What do you mean?
I'm just trolling.
Well, are you trying to troll, saying that I often leave pull requests unreviewed?
Yeah, I've got at least 4 sitting here.
But you said you have more. Oh, you meant more waiting for me to review.
Correct. Yeah.
I see. Yeah, I'm not going to say that's not the case.
You broke the bit.
Yeah, it's fun to talk about the joke. That makes the joke funnier.
Okay, well,
the one thing about that pull request I was wondering about is
do a live review.
We have the updated string just hard coded into a variable in the cube map TypeScript file, and I think it would be a nice little elegant thing if we queried the changelog that I created, which has the date as a front matter object. And I just got the most recent date of that front matter object, so there's only one place the date has to exist.
Yeah, give me 2 minutes.
I just couldn't remember how to do the queries in non-page components, and was certain if I tried to do it, I would either fail or do it wrong and have to be replaced.
Yeah,
anyway.
I mean, you're doing it not in the.
It's a static query we have to use right at that point.
Well, I guess we could do it there. I was thinking that we would want to do it in the build process, but yeah, we could just do it.
I was just going to do it in the actual.
It'll still happen at build time, but you just do it in the component. Yeah, that's very doable.
That's what I was going to do.
It might actually be a little bit annoying. Maybe we have to just play with the Gatsby query thing.
We also don't have to do that. It's fine that it's a string, but that was the one thing I thought maybe could be improved.
How confident are you that these changelog updates are actually going to be reliably added?
What do you mean?
Is that safe to treat as the one source of truth, or are we going to not?
Yeah. At the very least, we could just put an update, like just said, updated the cube map from this many cubes to this many cubes.
If you say so.
It also makes Jet write a description every time, which is good.
Okay.
Put a little pressure on him. All right. So have to do the close the podcast.
I thought you did that already.
I didn't, actually. Thank you for listening to Lucky Paper Radio. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the magic cards are made by Wizards of the Coast. All listening is done by you, and all the talking is done by me, Andy, and my co-host, Anthony. Thanks for talking about magic with me, Anthony.
Just this pull request is a bunch of stuff I wrote in it too, so I just need to go by commit, which... Oh, it's just this last commit.
Just the last commit, which is
cool.
adding the changelog. I did it one big commit, which I think is what you prefer, right? You don't like a bunch of little commit strings?
Yeah, good reviewable size. This good mind size chunk. Anyway, magic!